Good evening. Good evening. My name is Larry Fuel. Can anybody hear me in the back? Can you hear me back there? Okay. I'm the director of the Global Affairs Center here at the college and a member of the faculty. I teach political science and really welcome all of you here tonight. This is the first of 4 discussions about life 10 years after the terrible events that occurred in 2001 that are simply referred to as 9/11. Everybody sort of knows what you mean when you say 9/11. But before I talk a little bit about the program and introduce the speaker, let me just get out of the way a couple of housekeeping chores. We've got coffee and tea and water in the back of the room. Help yourselves. We have a wireless microphone that we'll be using during the question and answer session. The reason for that is the program is being recorded for additional use by students in classrooms. So we ask that if you have a question, and we'll have a chance for that you speak into the microphone. Most of us can yell loud enough that we don't really need it, but it makes for a better recording if we use a microphone. You will find a question card in your handout. As you're listening to the speaker, write down your questions. If you prefer, you can pass your question to one of the persons that will be collecting them during the question and answer session, or you can ask the question yourself simply by raising your hand, and we will get to you that way. There's also a little feedback sheet as part of your program. We want to know what you liked and disliked about tonight's program. Your responses help us do a better job of planning future events. So please help us to keep improving. And there's also a spot where if you'd like to be on a contact list for future programs, it's there as well as part of that same sheet. You can tear it off to maintain your anonymity. And last but not least, please turn off or silence your cell phones. In fact, I'm going to do that myself right now. Yeah, good thing I did that. Okay. As I said, much has been said in recent weeks about the events of 10 years later that we all just sort of called 9/11. And the focus of a lot of the discussions in the last couple months has been on the immediate actions and the emotions of emergency responders, victims of the attacks, and their families. What we're hoping to do here in this series of events, and this is just the first of 4, is we want to have a conversation that examines how our thinking has evolved since then about some important ideas. And we start tonight by talking about security to us as individuals and as nations and as a global community. Then next week we're going to be talking about, and we'll be talking about obviously tonight some of the responses, but next week we're going to continue the discussion by talking about alternative responses. We'll be looking at the commercial side, the trade side, as well as the military side. So we'll be doing that next week. And then we're going to talk about the concepts of religious tolerance and interfaith cooperation, and sort of how our thinking has evolved on that in the last 10 years. And then we're going to be talking about the needs of military veterans and the public attitudes toward military service and what those needs are. And anyone who doubts the importance of that story might want to listen to a report that I just heard this evening. It was aired on NPR, National Public Radio, today. It's called The Gap Grows Between Military and Civilians on War. You can find a link to the story at www.npr.org, and you go to their programs, All Things Considered, and find it there. But tonight we begin with the concept of security. What does it mean to be secure in today's world? What does it require to be secure? And how does our sense of national security affect our relationships with others, be they friends or their foes? Tonight's speaker is no stranger to the subject. Stacer Holcomb served in the U.S. Navy for 36 years. He rose to the rank of Vice Admiral before he retired in 1985. He began his Navy career as a pilot, and over the course of his career served in numerous leadership roles, including, as one of his last ones, I believe, was as he was commander of several naval vessels, and finally he was the commander of the 7th Fleet in the Pacific Ocean. During his active career, he served as military assistant to 2 Secretaries of Defense, Harold Brown and Don Rumsfeld. The first time that Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense in the 1970s. After retiring from the Navy, he became a senior executive at USAA, which is a major insurance and financial services provider that serves primarily military families. Its headquarters is somewhere in Texas. In 2001, shortly after he moved back to the Pacific Northwest, because this is where his roots are, he was called back to some duty in Washington, D.C. This time he was retired, but he was called back as an advisor to Donald Rumsfeld, the new, again, Secretary of Defense. I say again because, as some of you might remember, Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense briefly under President Ford in the 1970s, when a much more junior captain, I believe, Holcomb served as his military aide. This time around, the retired Admiral Holcomb served as a special assistant for succession planning, basically the nuts and bolts of how senior military officers are promoted and assigned. These and other details about the speaker tonight can be found in the program itself. The way we've sort of structured this is Admiral Stacer is going to speak for about 30, 40 minutes, and then we're going to be opening the floor to questions and have further discussion. We will be ending it by about 8:30. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Admiral Stacer Holcomb.
Well, I applaud what Larry has been doing here at the school on great issues in this particular series, so it's a pleasure to be able to start in this program as well. Larry, did you just say the post-9/11 world?
Yes.
All this time I thought you were talking about the post-1911 world, because that's where I'm starting my story. You know, the first 100 years of the Republic, we seem to be happy isolationists, as Jefferson said in his first inaugural address. Still among one thing more, my fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, which shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, equal and exact justice to all men of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political, peace, commerce, honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. You've heard some of those words before. I felt that, looking back on our history, that the turn of the 20th century marked a radical change in what we'd been doing up until that time as a nation. We'd pretty much acted as isolationists. If you built walls around our borders, we stayed inside the walls. The world would leave us alone. We'd leave them alone. We wouldn't be involved in the traditional troubles in Europe any longer. And those were ideas which prevailed in the population. But 100 years ago, more or less, 1911, the Spanish-American War, as you'll recall, was a pretty recent memory. It was a chest-thumping kind of a campaign that went on for a few days and resulted in our having access to Cuba, our having access to the Philippines, to Guam. All of a sudden, we were stepping away from our isolationist condition and taking on world problems. And we ended up, at that point, very much aware, in the Far East at least, of Russia and Japanese naval forces that were after each other and would soon be at war in 1905. And we began to realize that our national security isn't a rigid structure. It is a fabric. And in that fabric, there are threads that run through it, one thread influencing another thread, maybe a thread tangling with another thread. So I felt that what I could do to start this discussion series is to examine some of the threads that affect the United States. In 1907, some of you may have read about the Great White Fleet that our bombastic President Theodore Roosevelt put together. 16 battleships, all painted white, sent them around the world to show the rest of the world that we could go anywhere we needed to go on the surface of this globe and sustain ourselves. Barely. Those ships were coal-powered, not distilled fuel. We had to pre-position bulk coal around the world so that we'd have a place to get our coal when we made the trip. But we did show the flag, showed the white ships, showed the American Navy off, and made our presence known, particularly in the Far East and around the Philippine Islands. Remember that the Panama Canal was under construction at this time, so we were seeing our way clear to refuel our ships less often and less painfully if we could go through the canal. So Roosevelt supported that. With the discovery of oil in 1859, we very quickly became the world's leading producer of oil. We hadn't got around to powering our ships with oil at that point, but we we were ready and aware of the need to provide an unbroken supply of oil to service American industry. And we're pretty high up in the list of world producers today. I don't know who keeps track of it, but Saudi Arabia is clearly the leading producer of oil. Russia is next, and we're third, all up around 10 or 11% of the total production of oil in the world. So oil is still a huge problem for the United States of America. It is a thread, undeniably, that runs through our military security industrial fabric. In 1911, if we start back that far, war clouds were threatening again in Europe. It seemed to be a perpetual war between the kingdoms in Europe, but the First World War was about to happen. The U.S. was trying to support its British allies. German submarine attacks began on our shipping before we entered that war. So we were trying to resupply Britain and France, and that would demand response from us in some form. In 1917, we mobilized. I note in passing that my father was mobilized in 1917, was a student at the University of Washington. He was sent to navigation school at Great Lakes Naval Training Base in Illinois. When he finished that course, he was a second-class quartermaster and immediately commissioned an ensign in the Navy. And it wasn't until just recently that I realized that all my life I'd been told that my father won World War I almost single-handedly as a deck watch officer on a transport going back and forth across the Atlantic. You never know what drives you in your career aspirations. In any event, what came to be called the First World War became serious to us, and we took our military forces from around 300,000 up to 3.8 million in a short period of time in order to supply troops in the trenches in the battles of Europe. It ended. We demobilized and sent all those people home and shrunk our military forces again and went back to pre-war, not conscription, but just pre-war sizing of our forces. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was the formal ending of that war. It was signed in 1919, and it severely punished the Germans for having started yet another war, assigned them strict reparations, and in the course of doing, and aside from doing that, the Balfour Declaration was entered into by the British Foreign Ministry, and it was the one that said, we'll make a homeland for the Jewish people in Europe, something that had been part of the structure of the First World War. Remember, the great powers in the First World War were the Germans, but coming in to help them was the Ottoman Empire, the caliph of whom lived in Turkey and submitted all the weight of the Muslim world to help the Central Powers win that war in Europe. When the war was over and they'd lost, yet another thread emerged, and that was that we were committed by 1919 to help produce a homeland for the Jewish state. We were also committed to support the Palestine Authority, which was created in those days. We're hearing about that in our news almost daily now. And all of that was aimed at giving other international organizations responsibility for the Arab inhabitants, about 45% of the population of that region, of the Middle Eastern region. And in our news today, the Palestine Authority is trying to get recognition by the United Nations and establish a state again. Our own president has ducked the problem. He switched positions, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen this year, but it's out there waiting to happen. Almost immediately after World War I ended, arms control became a central matter of policy and an issue with our country. We started with the use of gas, which had been so devastating in the trenches of Europe. We started with negotiating limitations on the armament of airplanes. The airplane had made its first appearance in World War I and was destructive, throwing bombs the size of bricks over the side out of the cockpit and wreaking havoc. But armament of those aircraft was prohibited by international rules. That prohibition didn't survive 20 years before World War II had started, and there was no limit on the armament of those airplanes. Restrictions on submarine warfare were put in place, and naval arms limitations. If you know your history, you know that in the 20s and 30s, we had major international conferences where the naval powers, less Germany, entered into agreement. If the British had 2 battleships, the United States could have 5, the French could each have, and Italians could each have 1, things like that, where the games were being played on the table, and we were entering into agreements that would somehow prevent another war from being started. And that thread runs through our history, past and present. We still try to enter into agreement to confine wars. The problem with naval arms limitation was the US, the Japanese, the French, and Italy negotiated. Germany didn't. Germany fell under no constraint 20 years later when the clouds began to stir for World War II. So they had a navy that was unrestrained. Back in Europe, at the same time, in the mid-1910s and 20s, among those most chafed by the Treaty of Versailles was the young corporal we've heard about all these years, who was so bitter about the way his country was treated by the major powers that he agitated for political power and position. It gave rise to the Nazi Party. That gave rise to the Third Reich. That gave rise to World War II that began some 10 years later. Americans were reluctant to get involved in yet another European war. But President Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was committed to supporting our oldest ally, England, and our newest ally, Russia, and the Lend-Lease program, which I remember well growing up in Seattle, where we would see loads of cargo leaving here to head over to resupply the British and the Russians. Convoys were instituted and anti-submarine warfare began again. The Two-Ocean Naval Expansion Act of July of 1940 started a production buildup, which you may recall. Boeing went absolutely crazy building airplanes, and ships were being built at a fantastic rate, like a Liberty ship in a week's time, a major warship in a couple of months' time, and we began as early as a year and a half before we entered the war to prepare ourselves for a two-ocean naval effort that was soon to come. Once again, the German submarine had to be countered almost immediately. Unrestricted submarine warfare was the rule. The Battle of Britain, which in Germany was called the Air Battle for England, a 4-month campaign to crush the RAF, followed in September of 1940 and was, as we all remember, a very close thing. In 1940 or early 41, we instituted a draft and began to swell or balloon our armed forces another time. In 1939, they'd been about 300,000. By 1945, they were over 12 million men and women serving in our armed forces. By 1950, 5 years later, back down to 1.4 million. Then the Korean War came along, back up to about 3 million. And then finally, by the 1990s, we were down to 2 million or less. The Empire of Japan's surprise attack on the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th plunged us for sure into a second world war. FDR had largely ignored the Pacific while trying to operate in cooperation with the British. We found ourselves engaged in a two-ocean war, and that war lasted for 6 years, ending in May of 1945, when Berlin fell to the Russians, the Americans, the British, and later French troops. In the Pacific side, the battle went on almost as long and ended, as you remember, in August of 1945, when the second of two atomic bombs, a new devastating weapon, was dropped on Japan, and a few days later, the emperor surrendered. Within 2 years after that, what we have subsequently called the Cold War had begun, pitting the Soviet Union against the victorious Allies, enclosing and partitioning Berlin and giving impetus to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which took 2 or 3 years to get started, but we ended up having a North Atlantic Treaty Organization on the one side and a Warsaw Pact on the other side, where the two surviving superpowers were supported by almost every other nation. One of the other supported one of the other superpowers. And NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was an attempt to contain Soviet expansionism in Europe. That meant that most of Europe was an armed camp for the next 40 years. NATO began with 14 member states. At the outset, NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, said, now the purpose of this organization is to keep the Russians out, to keep the Americans in, to keep the Germans down. It certainly proved to be a durable organization. When you look at the newspaper today, you find out that NATO is very active in the Libyan campaign and in Afghanistan, and command for those operations have been put under a NATO organization. It began with 14 member states. They've done some amazing and good things, standardizing ammunition, standardizing refueling, putting the same kind of fuels in the pipelines all over Europe. They were able to prepare Europe to fight a war, and with procedures and electronics and fuel and ammunition matched and made possible. After the end of the Cold War in 1989, NATO grew to 28 members, a doubling of it, including many of the nations that had formerly been in the Soviet bloc. They agreed in principle that an attack on any one of them would be considered to be an attack on all. And as a result, they've played a major role in the International Security Assistance Force, operations in Afghanistan, the Arab Spring unrest at the present time. At age 62, NATO remains an impressive partnership. There haven't been many like that. It has in the aggregate about 70% of the world's defense budgets are among the NATO countries. So there's another thread for us to keep an eye on when we think about the continuity of that joint effort, the resources involved, and the ground already covered. There was a new United Nations created in 1945. It proved to be little more effective than the old League of Nations had after World War I, but it did create a forum in which shall we say, the survival and security of the major powers was up for debate by the minor powers, and we still see that going on in the NATO proceedings. There's another thread to keep an eye on. In 1948, the state of Israel became independent, and the United States immediately endorsed and recognized the new nation, and it has since then been a touchstone of American politics and policy. Support and survival of Israel is a key objective in our thinking. A couple of Arab-Israeli conflicts, the big ones were 1967 and 1973, reinforced that, and we have gone consistently to bat for our partner. Another thread, after World War II ended, and in the spirit of negotiating controls and limitations on arms, a lot of effort went into maintaining or minimizing, containing the spread of atomic weapons. By 1949, the Russians had developed their own atomic bomb. By 1954, they had demonstrated that they'd learned thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb technology. They would soon catch up with the United States in testing and in the race for a deterrent using these weapons. Mutual assured destruction was what we called it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The idea of two superpowers, they were pretty symmetrical in the way they were organized, and they had large cities, they had ship forces, they had bases, they had airplanes. The two superpowers sort of stood toe-to-toe and threatened to blow the other off the map if they used nuclear weapons first. It was a deterrence based on the fear and the holding hostage of targets in each other's country with a hair trigger that lasted for 3 decades, and before we became less antagonistic and before we became ready to control the size of these inventories. They were like 10,000 nuclear weapons on each side. We're talking big numbers of weapons targeted in missiles, in bombs, in gun ammunition, shipboard cannon and gun ammunitions. It was the biggest box game in town. The two sides would meet separately, decide on what action they could take to throw the other one off guard and to deter positively any use of nuclear weapons, and on and on. It worked because of the symmetry of the two power systems, not because of their differences. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, short title SALT, began in 1975 and 1976. They've continued under the name Strategic Arms Reduction Talks more or less ever since. They haven't got there yet. The large numbers of weapons on each side exist still. The number that are declared to be operational and active is a controlled number that we agree to from time to time in talking. But it just turns out, if you think about it, no surprise, that getting rid of these weapons isn't as simple as taking a bulldozer and pushing them into the landfill. These are technical, radioactive, highly complex weapon systems. So there are a lot around yet. And that gives us a lot of concern in this present climate as to what happens if an adversary gets a hold of one or part of one of these weapons and decides to hold a whole country hostage to a improvised attack in a large city. We spend a lot of time trying to understand how nuclear materials, plutonium and uranium, move around freely around the country, around the world. Who has them? Is Iran successfully producing enough nuclear material and centrifuges to be able to put a bomb together? If they didn't have enough to put a bomb together, could they steal one from the old Soviet Union or buy one? And thinking through the implications of not 10,000 against 10,000, but one against the world gives a person pause. We're not there yet in getting rid of these. On both sides, there is an agreed number that are called ready weapons. It's a huge number. And then there are retired or standby or reserve weapons that still exist but may not be operational. Their nuclear non-proliferation treaty agreed upon in 1973 was aimed at keeping other countries out of this game. It didn't succeed. There are 6 nuclear club members now, and there are some wannabes that are running around the outside and may well turn out to break the code and get into the club. Having demobilized in 1945 and 46, we were caught by surprise in 1950 when, backed by communist China and Russia, North Korea made a lightning attack south and seized the city of Seoul and the Democratic Republic of Korea. It took us the better part of 3 years in assisting the South Koreans to turn that attack back and drive the North Korean forces north of the 38th parallel of latitude, where they are today. But I would note in passing that they have not renounced their intention or desire to take Seoul and take South Korea back into the fold as one single Korea, another thread in our fabric of national security. We're committed to preventing that from happening. In the mid-20th century, Soviet and communist expansion, both to east and west, emerged, and we found that in our own country we were not prepared to deal with this bifocal problem. We ended up forming a Department of Defense in 1947, made up of formerly autonomous departments of the Army, the new Department of the Air Force, and the old Department of the Navy, and created one single executive with authority over them all. Under President Kennedy, an attempt was made to strengthen the exercise of control and power by this single secretary. And Robert McNamara became Secretary of Defense. He was a whiz kid from the Ford Motor Company who had put econometric analysis to play in making production and design decisions in an automobile company. And he became an advocate for what he called systems analysis, which is to say, it must be possible with more formal planning and programming and budgeting in the Department of Defense to determine with some precision how much of one weapon system and one army and one program is enough, and how we get a balance between them all to accomplish our objectives. It was an economics-based and disciplined approach, and for a period of about 10 years it held sway and absolutely seized the initiative from the Congress. Up to that point in time, going back to early days of the Republic, the committees of Congress decided what we ought to have in the way of forces or equipment and turned those over to the Department of the Navy or Department of War to let them operate that equipment, but there was no question about what they were going to buy and where it was going to be built. I used to love the story that in John Adams' account of being the first chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee in the new Congress. He was told he could have 6 frigates. One had to be built in New York, one had to be built in Philadelphia, one had to be built in South Carolina, one in Washington, one in Norfolk. And by the way, the timber for these ships had to be bought in South Carolina, and the gunpowder had to be made in Pennsylvania. And so pretty much the U.S. Navy was started with 6 frigates, the first of which we know as USS Constitution. And then a couple of later ships later was the Constellation. And that was the way, an example of the way our military hardware was created. The McNamara approach was revolutionary and took that on. McNamara used to impress, or not impress, frighten the congressional committees when he would come to a hearing on the budget with a couple of grocery carts full of books and binders, and he would say, this, Mr. Chairman or Mr. Congressman, these are the things we need. We need precisely 2 of these. They'll cost that much. They will build them where we found the best price and the best delivery time, and we don't need any more. That's enough. And of course, the Congress was not used to dealing with that kind of specificity. McNamara, in his approach, started with strategy and objectives. For example, we were going to prepare during the 60s for 2.5 wars. That was the language used. A full-scale war in Europe, the NATO and Warsaw Pact War, a full-scale war in Asia, which might well be the Korean War again, and then a half war, which would be a contingency somewhere else. The closest thing we really came to that was Vietnam, which turned out to be pretty big and didn't turn out to be a contingency per se, and put a strain on the approach. But given a strategy that was explicit, then McNamara and his people looked at alternative ways of carrying out the strategy, alternative systems for carrying it out, how much they should cost, how many of them we should buy, and the Secretary of Defense would go in front of the Congress with his ducks in a row. He had his facts, he had the numbers, and for the better part of 10 years, they were back on their heels trying to figure out how to deal with this phenomenon. And they formed a Congressional Budget Office and a General Accountability Office and a few other governmental agencies to try to take the analytical approach. But through the 60s, the logic of the Defense Department budgeting system held sway. Then in 1964 to 73 came that little war, the troublesome little war that went on, highly politicized. It defied both logic and econometrics. And one of the things that comes to mind is that one of the ideas that came out in there was to build an electronic wall across Vietnam that would detect audibly the sounds of trucks moving from north to south, the sounds of troops crackling through the brush, and that would be an alternative to putting troops and airplanes up over in the sky over this all and trying to keep track of things moving on the ground. I leave it to you to decide whether that was a good idea or not. In any event, trying to pay for that conflict with with an econometric analysis of strategy and alternatives was so different from the way we were posturing for the larger war that it was discredited. And by the time McNamara left office in 1968, systems analysis per se was being pushed back. About the same time, a new threat emerged for the first time. Terrorist attacks on U.S. interests and against Americans, which actually had begun a long time before 2001, were coming at annual intervals around the world. Bombs set off in Puerto Rico. In Tehran, the radical students seizing the U.S. embassy and taking hostages. In Lebanon, the U.S. embassy in Beirut. Suicide bombers, a truck at the barracks in Beirut International Airport, killing a lot of people, 214 people. All of these attacks were performed by fanatic people willing to sacrifice their life or the lives of the people around them to inflict a devastating blow on what they came to call the Great Satan over time. About this time, President George H.W. Bush directed a study on combating terrorism that took hold in the government and examined what resources the country had for understanding this problem, detecting the threat, and doing something about it and communicating. It foretold actually what came on in 2001 after the attack by the airplanes on the World Trade Center. And we again examined what resources we had, who should be doing what, and we found out that we hadn't got it right yet. It became clear in the late 80s, early 90s, that Islamic terrorists had clear objectives in mind and were pursuing those, one target at a time. The objectives appeared to be eliminate Western power and influence. Remember, Khomeini called us the Great Satan, and that was part of the rhetoric that went on. That influence and example that the United States was setting wherever it worked and served had to be eliminated. Besides eliminating Western power and influence, the goal was to break down the economic and military strength of the leading one of these powers in some fashion, probably clearly directed at the United States. The third objective was clearly to put fundamentalist governments in place in all of the countries that had once been under the caliphate before World War I. And incidentally, the fourth one was destroy the state of Israel, which was an offense to all Muslims. It's not hard to make a connection between those clear objectives that we've been thinking about for a dozen years, hearing about, and the wave of discontent that has swept through through the Middle East. It's called the Arab Summer in the press. There is dissatisfaction with the leadership, with having dictators over the governments. There is a notion of, if we're going to restore the caliphate, we want to have a fundamentalist Muslim government in each of the key states of the region. So we see under the theme, the people want to bring down the regime. We see turmoil in Egypt, in Libya, Bahrain, Syria, and so on, Western Sahara. Many of the Muslim Brotherhood are involved in these things rippling through the region. A thread that we have to take into account trying to figure out what we're going to do. Other terrorist attacks, the bomb exploded in the World Trade Center garage in 1993. 96, a Saudi Arabia truck bomb exploded by Islamic militants outside Khobar Towers. 1998, truck bombs exploded almost simultaneously near the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And the people that had been involved in these, it turned out, had trained in Afghanistan. And then came the 9/11 event, and we've all reviewed the history of that pretty carefully. It also turns out that since 9/11, there's been another major terrorist event directed at the Great Satan somewhere in the world about every year. so that the terrorist campaign goes on. Nothing as big and devastating as the one in 9/11 was. There have been some changes that have taken place in the past 10 years that are worth noting. We've changed from a force that was modeled after the kind of war that might happen on the central front of Europe. Armor, bridges across the rivers, heavy artillery, and mass divisions. We've broken down our counterpart to that, to where we have changed into light, agile, and lethal smaller units of force of the kind that have been deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. SEALs, Rangers, reconnaissance teams, unmanned surveillance and attack vehicles, stealth aircraft, mountain warfare, counterinsurgency. We have gone a long way in lightening up and making more lethal and more agile our forces. It's not a stretch in my mind to see the connection between the fundamentalist goals in the Middle East and the disturbances and riots that are going on in the Arab Spring. They have taken down or shaken government after government. Radical rejection of liberalism, which enabled Muslims to immigrate throughout Europe, has manifested itself in riots and terrorist attacks as well. We keep hearing about these things. One of the recent ones was in Norway, where a man called Breivik, after putting online a manifesto, decried Muslims bent on destroying Christian Europe. That's kind of a reverse crusade with a Muslim invasion putting a strain on the Christian church in Europe instead of the other way around. The Crusades 700-800 years ago seemed to involve Christian armies going down to straighten out the Arab kingdoms, and we're seeing something else going on in Europe right now. Whoever said it, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. It may be Thomas Paine, or it may have been Socrates who said that, but they got it about right. Another development, which is awe-inspiring, is the cyber warfare threat that has continued and will continue on into our future. We've been getting some ideas of the scope of this problem in the last year or so, with WikiLeaks, with hacking of all kinds, with bringing down electronic systems, with bringing down the controlling mechanisms for Iranian production of nuclear fuel, Stuxnet. We can take down power grids. We could take down, or they could take down, the global positioning satellite. Cyber warfare was used in inciting groups to riot in England in the past few months, in organized looting. The whole idea is information superiority in using, whether it's the internet or the computer itself, to gather intelligence and maybe to do some bullying on a global scale. So where are we today? I've tried to touch on the threads that keep running through all of this without coming to a specific conclusion. Orderly thinking and planning for national security has all but disappeared in the rhetoric that's gone on in the last year about budgets, deficits, debt ceilings. Big numbers are being thrown around by people who have no idea what those numbers mean or what the unintended consequences of a cut here or a slashing there would mean. The attacks on the Department of Defense have been, the goal is $450 billion over a 10-year period. I can visualize $450 billion. I have no idea how those are going to be cut or what the second and third order implications of cutting them would be. But defense spending has always been a stalking horse for people those who have other objectives and who want to cut that money, whatever the cost. Given the explosion of information technology and the symmetry of the adversaries we face, the increasing lethality of weaponry, the duration of conflict we can expect, no more brief Spanish-American wars. Our goal should be to recognize what our national interests are, which are the paramount ones, what tools we want to have in our toolbox, how many of them we need, what condition they need to be maintained in, and where they need to be placed. We need to recognize what we do well and what we cannot do well. Now, China and Russia remain standing tall adversaries for this country. There can be little doubt about that. 25 years ago, when the Soviet Union came apart, the immediate threats the Russians posed to the United States dropped off considerably. They still had all those nuclear weapons. They still had a hair trigger on them, but the intent to use them and the organization to secure them and maintain them fell apart. At that time, about the time I retired from the Navy, our judgment was that the military threat from Russia had fallen off markedly, but that we had to keep watching them, that the military threat from China was 25 years in the future. It's 25, that's now. Not bad. That is to say, we didn't know how to deal with it, but we recognized the fact that it would take that country with that economy and in that starting position a good 2.5 decades to be in a position to pose a threat to U.S. interests in the region. Now, the Chinese have long maintained the one China policy. Three stumbling blocks in that policy are the island of Taiwan, the island of Quemoy, and the island of Matsu, which they, in their view, are part of one China and are to be restored and brought back into the Democratic Republic of China. So if there is a point at which a fire might break out in that part of the world, less likely to come from Russia than from China, more likely to be over the one China issue and policy. The weapons that the Chinese have developed and demonstrated to us have been weapons which would deter us from operating comfortably in those waters and that close to the Chinese mainland. They don't show the ability to export troops and military power more than too far away from their own coasts, but they show both a stated intent and a capability with anti-ship missiles and other weaponry to give us a hard time if they choose to do it. So we've clearly got to think about that in defining what our objectives are. The fact that China produces almost everything we buy these days is an interesting observation. The fact that Chinese the ownership of the larger part of our debt puts us in a funny position with respect to another major power. Take a while to correct that. So, where are we then in this discussion? Foreign entanglements are a thing of the present. We haven't avoided those, and we probably won't. An uninterrupted requirement for oil, nothing we've done so far has reduced that requirement or the momentum in that requirement much. We're accustomed to ballooning and shrinking our manpower, but in the military, but we pay a terrible price for doing that. We are in international partnerships, and I see no way we will not be in the future. The homeland for the Jewish people, the State of Israel, both of those are commitments on our part and have been for, these 30-some years. Arms control efforts will continue. We still have to wrestle to the ground the disposition of those huge nuclear weapons inventories on both sides, to say nothing of some of the other weapons that have come into play. We were worried for all those decades in Europe about Soviet expansion and constraining that. Russian expansion doesn't look quite that burdensome, but they haven't given up the rhetoric that goes with it. We do have a question of who has responsibility in our country for structuring, sizing, and equipping our forces. Who's in charge of this process? Are we back to having congressional committees doing it on this is built in my district basis, or are we going to turn to the executive to define a strategy, to consider alternatives for ways of carrying out the strategy, alternative systems, pricing those out, and exercising control over their operation and construction. We have the international terrorism problem. It doesn't seem to be letting up. Incidents are coming pretty steadily at us, and we're not all that much better in deterring it and predicting it. The lethality, agility, mobility of our forces are changing, and that's a good thing. Cyber warfare is coming on strong. You may have taken note of the fact that a few months ago, the commander of the Defense Security Agency at Fort Meade was given a double hat of being the head of cyber warfare. So he is now working on what that means. How do we know when we're under attack? How do we know how to counter that attack? How do we know how to secure our systems against attack? Chinese expansionism, as I indicated, remains a problem of considerable concern. They're doing fine with their technology and with their production, but they haven't given up on taking back Taiwan. They haven't given up on owning the offshore islands that have been a bone in their craw all these years. And then the question is, how much is enough of each weapon system, each component, each tool in our toolbox? How are we going to know that? We have to ask ourselves which threads, if any, have become more important, which have become less important, which dictate different solutions. We know how to do that. We've been through a decade of where we did that with great precision, took a lot of work and a part of a lot of people, and we may not be able to make progress in this until an administration decides to make explicit what our national security concerns and priorities are, and then turns over to the people who will deliver on those explicit priorities the responsibility for identifying and pricing the alternatives. I would look to see that happening. There's a crying need for that kind of thinking. I've spun down enough. It's time for you all to ask questions or get involved in this discussion.
Let's give him just a moment to have a drink of water. And we're going to try to sit over there, right? And just give him just a 1 second to sort of catch his breath, and maybe you can talk to your neighbor a moment about sort of what were the, to your left and your right, you know, what were the sort of the big things they talked about that stick in your head, or things that you hope he talked about, didn't want to talk about, he didn't mention, and that you want to bring up in your questions. Again, whoops, let me go to the microphone here, I'm sorry. Neil, the microphone, you've got the mic, okay, hold your hand up there. We got somebody with a microphone. If you want to ask your own question, he'll run up to you. If you want to write a question down on a piece of paper and just pass it to the sides, we will pick them up, and then we will try to get all the questions answered as best we can. But are you ready?
We got a microphone here that works and you can hear?
Okay.
Good.
All right. We got a
Yeah,
question?
Admiral Holcomb, the last question you posed, you said that we need to have our leaders express and determine what our goals and aspirations should be in this, and decide on the proper policy. I'd be interested in hearing what you would suggest that be in terms of what the government should do.
To be explicit about what with So I think the answer to your question is we need to make the leadership of our country aware of the need for being explicit in what we're trying to do and an open discussion of how we're going to go about it. And then we figure out how to do it and how much of it we need and where we need to put it. The whole process has been pretty invisible, hasn't it, for the last couple of years.
It has, and it's been infused with politics to the extent that it makes it very difficult.
Yep.
Okay, I can probably do it without the mic. United States.
The problem is the microphone, the camera won't pick up. Your hand in the mic.
United States has always projected its strength through the Navy for a long, long time. And today, the Navy has fewer than 300 ships. How is the country able to cover the Pacific, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and all the other areas with so few ships?
I'm kind of not in that business to know the details of that. We, for years, have recognized that a visible presence in areas of interest to us does more than anything held back at home to deter conflict and to show our interest. So forward presence is the goal. And you have to balance the number of ships you've got over the number of places you want to be and how hard you want to work the people that run those ships and maintain the presence that you agree is necessary to deter conflict or attack. Now, that's not simple arithmetic, but it is something that can be made explicit. We will, for example, if we are committed to the defense of Taiwan and offshore islands, the one tool in our toolbox that is probably most effective against the present Chinese threat is tactical aircraft operated from ships or bases along the Asian seaboard that can stop an attack from massing and gathering and carrying out its mission. So one can decide what kind of a presence you need to maintain to convey the signal that we're there, we're ready, we'll fight, and you don't want to start that particular problem. We have what we have. I mean, these ships take a long time to build and a lot of effort to keep going. In a world that controlled by a Navy, we'd have 3 or 4 times that many ships, but then we might not have enough left over to do an Air Force and a Marine Corps and Army division. So we have to strike a balance. But being there is a big part of the problem. Yes, sir.
I just want to add on to this one thing, if I can. I'm another retired admiral with great respect for Admiral Hochman. I'll be speaking next week, but this is the area that you asked the question is the area that I've done a lot of my own work. And the thing that you should be aware of is the ships we have today are incredibly more lethal in their capability than the ships we had in the past. One demonstration was several years ago when we intercepted a satellite with one of our missiles fired from one of our ships. We hit what we aim at with every round that we fire, which is a great departure from the days of the naval treaties limiting the number of battleships that we have. The Admiral made the point about the tyranny of geography. One ship can only be in one place at one time. Ships have gotten very expensive, but the most important and expensive part of the ships are our crew. So what we've been doing over the past several decades is engineering the requirement for crew smaller and smaller and smaller. Our newer ships will have crews even down in the neighborhood of 75 to 100 crewmen compared to ships that had as many as 300 and 500 crewmen in years past. And they'll be able to stay on station much longer, and we'll be able to switch the crews so that we can put a ship out there for as much as 2 years, and in the midpoint, swap the crew for another crew and leave it on station. So a lot of thought is being put into answering your question to try to meet the demands of both living within the budget and still meeting those requirements. So I think both of us share your concern. I mean, the world isn't getting smaller, and you can only go so fast in a ship, even with new technology. But I wanted to give you some assurance that a lot of thought has been put into that, and you will see the Navy of the future look much different than the Navy that you're familiar with. They're going to do the job, and they're going to protect the country, but it's going to take a lot of innovative approaches to make that work. So forgive me for leaping in there, and forgive me, the other nice person that was going to ask a question.
Hello. There has not been a physical attack on the United States since September 11th, 2001. And I was wondering what you attributed that to.
What I attributed that attack to? I didn't understand the question.
The fact that we have not had a terrorist attack on this country since September 11th, 2001, what do you attribute that to, the fact that we have not been attacked since then?
I tried to point out to you that we have had terrorist attacks at almost annual intervals since 9/11. They haven't been as big, as devastating. They haven't always been successful, but I think that we, right or wrong, we made a rather quick deployment of warfighting forces to the sources of the training of the terrorists as best we knew them, and of the most openly antagonistic of the Middle Eastern countries. We've been there for 10 years in Afghanistan. We've been there for 7 or more years in Iraq. I have 2 daughters in Iraq right now. I really care about this. I have to think that being there is a big part of why we haven't had more successful attacks on us. If you're deployed in your fighting garb, ready to go to war over another terrorist attack, the opposition has to think that through pretty carefully and attack at a different time in a different place, and maybe not at all, because you're ready. You're deployed, you're ready, your military capability is there. So in the broad, I think we haven't had another 9/11 scale or anything near that, because we've been there ready to fight and ready to go after Al-Qaeda, go after the training grounds, and they know that. So they need to be more clever, more devious, more determined, but they know that there will be a reaction. So that's a hard position to take, but I think that's probably why we haven't had another major one.
Hi, I'm, can you hear me? Amy Kinsel. I teach American history here at the college. And I was very interested to hear your threads that you ran through in your nice historical summary. But I think you left out a couple of threads that we should possibly discuss. One is faulty intelligence. Throughout U.S. history, there's been a series of mistakes made militarily because of faulty intelligence. You started out with the Spanish-American War. The sinking of the U.S. Maine was not an attack on the U.S. It was an accident. It was thought to be an attack at the time. The so-called attack on the ship in the Tonkin Gulf that caused the Tonkin Gulf resolution was not an attack. That was faulty information from sonar men who thought that they saw something on their sonar screens. There was no attack. The NSC 68 resolution that said that, a memo that said that Soviets were bent on world expansion, George Kennan possibly was wrong in his long telegram about the extent of Soviet expansionism. The U.S. was wrong about the fact that the U.S. assumed that North Vietnam was being controlled by the Chinese. So faulty intelligence is rampant in U.S. history and leads to incorrect assumptions, incorrect decision-making about wars. So the other thing that you also didn't cover in your historical summary was U.S. occupations. The Spanish-American War was not a 5-day war. The Spanish-American War was followed by a 2-year occupation of the Philippines and the conquest of the Philippines by the United States. So the question that just was asked about U.S. presence in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, it could be the case that that presence is antagonizing potential terrorists, that that presence is unwelcome, or that that presence is not creating the change of opinion that the U.S. hopes that it would create. There's a recent book out by somebody from, I'm blanking out on his name, but he's written a book that says that the U.S. efforts in Afghanistan have been ineffective, and that the U.S. is not doing the right thing in its occupation.
Talking about 3 cups of tea?
Yes, I think so, yes. So I'd just like to have your response to the idea that there's other threads here that should be discussed, including what's going on with U.S. intelligence. Do we have any better intelligence now than we've had historically, which hasn't been all that great? And what is the effect of U.S. occupying other countries, which we have done repeatedly in the past, and we're now having U.S. troops on the ground effectively, in our view, is not necessarily occupying, but in the view of the people in those countries, the U.S. is occupying their countries.
Intelligence is kind of the first failure that we observe in anything that happens. Why didn't we know that? Why didn't we reason that? Why didn't these 2 organizations talk with each other and develop a picture that leadership could know and act upon? We tend to reorganize intelligence after every international disaster. I remember reading a few years ago an illustrative anecdote about the way policing was done in the earliest years of our civilization in this country, and what has become of it. Policing was probably at the very best with a policeman walking down the street, knowing everybody there and keeping track of what was going on in the street. But we found out we couldn't afford to keep policemen on foot patrol, at least not in pairs, and then at least not all the time. So we ended up with radio patrol cars where there'd be 2 policemen in a car and be vectored by a radio station that would tell them when something was happening. Then we found out we couldn't keep doing that because we couldn't afford the manpower, so we would have 1 policeman in the car. And so knowing what is going on is a big problem in policing. Being in Afghanistan and being in Iraq is, at the moment, kind of like having a police substation in each place. The opposition knows they're there. The opposition fires rockets into their living areas and tries to frighten them off, but in the meantime they're there, and they're there with weapons and vehicles, and they're ready to retaliate. So there is some value, you'd have to admit, in having a policeman on the spot in a troubled area. Now, what can we do in the larger sense about knowing what's going on there? I don't know. We've spent billions of dollars trying to take pictures of what's going on the ground, trying to read it and listen to radio and telephone transmissions, trying to piece it all together. Since 9/11, we have made extraordinary progress in having agencies share intelligence, which is a no-no in the long history of intelligence forces. Information is power. You never share what you know with anybody, not your side, not their side. You just keep. So we've made progress. That doesn't mean we won't be blindsided by another frightful attack that we could have known about if intelligence had only interpreted things differently. That's sort of an answer. I can't defend it. That's just the way it is. Intelligence is a combination of detection of or photographing or otherwise being aware of physical objects, of reading motives, of having connections inside the other guy's operations as well as your own, putting that information in front of decision makers in a timely fashion, in a persuasive way. And then I know as a leader, and I've known our other leaders in our government, that you cannot wait for all that you'd like to know before you move. You've got to go on what you know and understand. If you're wrong, you're really wrong. But you couldn't have waited for more information. You have a decision to make. You're ready to deploy your ships or deploy your airplanes. So you do it on the basis of the best information you've got, and you try to keep yourself aware of the situation so that you are processing that information and new information all the time. But I don't know an answer to how we can make it crystal clear and perfect. It isn't, life is not like that.
Is this working? Okay. Oh, a couple questions have been passed to me in writing. Let me ask one of those while the rest of you are sort of digesting that one. And this question, can you hear me okay? This question concerns one of the last things you talked about, that of cyber warfare. And it's really a two-part question. The first part is, in terms of cyber warfare, what does the U.S. need to accomplish to be able to successfully defend itself against external attacks, cyber attacks? And then the second part of the question is, does the current policy of equivalent response affect the speed at which this deficiency be addressed? You probably need to explain equivalent response as part of that. So the first part is, what does the U.S. need to accomplish to be successful against cyber, in your opinion?
Does it have to do with gentlemen reading each other's mail?
Probably.
A great no-no in civilized world. You got to know, by any means you can find it, what the other side knows and is planning on doing and is capable of doing it. Those three are big variables. Cyber warfare is as I see it, and I don't think we've defined what we're going to do yet, but it is gathering information, processing it continuously, and displaying it, taking advantage of everything we know we can make a computer do, and reading other people's mail. It is a Byzantine world.
Second part, can I ask you this, repeat the second part of this question? The current policy of quote unquote equivalent response, how does that affect the speed at which you respond to threats, cyber warfare threats?
It's kind of like, I use this analogy, having a toolbox that you have prepared and loaded and placed where you need it, where you can grab it on your way out the door. And when you have a problem, you grab the most likely collection of tools and employ them in the most intelligent way you can. And that's the way we would proceed in the cyber warfare thing. You don't know it all. You can't know it all. You can use all the technology that we can muster to find out what the other guy knows and what he is doing with what he knows. And that's one of the tools in your toolbox. That's an evasive answer. I don't know a better answer.
Admiral Holcomb, my question is, what would be a way for the U.S. and the other members of the nuclear club to deal with nuclear proliferation in the 21st century?
I didn't get the question part.
Oh, well, what can the U.S. and the other members of the nuclear club do for nuclear proliferation in the 21st century? I'm just wondering if there's any new ways that weren't tried in the 20th or anything. So
You've got to know what is going on.
So just intelligence?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a big part of it. I'm thinking as I stand here, so far, Iran has been deterred from becoming a nuclear power. Ahmadinejad said that he wants to be one, expects to be one. The Arab world is expecting him to do that. When he was getting closer and closer, a cyber attack, apparently, Stuxnet, broke up this processing system, and it didn't, and his progress wasn't as great as he thought it was going to be, and he doesn't have the material yet. And that's kind of a model for what you're asking. You need to know all you can know. You need the brightest minds you've got to figure out from what you do know what courses of action are available to the other person. Then you've got to know how you have the capability of, I mean, we've known that the Israelis, who will be the subject of, most likely, the nuclear capability of Iran, we know that they have kind of spring-loaded attack plans for how to wipe out, as soon as they know there is such a thing, how to wipe it out in terms of weaponry and the ability to strike at them. That's kind of how I model your question. You need to know all you can learn. You need to reason through it. You need to try to pin down where things are and what the state of progress is. Then you try to bring outside pressure to bear on the would-be culprit to see whether you can't bottle it up and not do it. And then ultimately, you hold the big hammer, which is to say, you demonstrate that you've got a weapon, and then there'll be 10 of them raining down on you in no time at all. You threaten, you learn, you conjecture, you analyze, you try to reason it through, and then you try to put all the pressure in all the right places to stop it from happening.
All right. Thank you.
Admiral Holcomb, my question was, you mentioned Stuxnet, and it's basically a virus that went in and shut down a computer or system. There are, I heard on NPR the other day that there are some scientists that it's basically gone somewhat viral, or parts of it have, that they're deconstructing it and finding these amazing things and just wonderful things. However, have we let the genie out of the bottle? I think of, say, the Manhattan Project or things like that. Being that we are so new to cyber warfare or defending against it, this was used and utilized, and now it's kind of out there. How do we temper our need for security with reasoning of the past and being cautious not to give away our liberties too?
The problem that faces a democracy, what we do and what we think is open for criticism and intervention all the time. And so keeping a secret is not easy for our democracy to do it. There are people that know a great deal more about all of that than I do, to know what we know and when we do it and what we're capable of doing about it. But we've got huge information superiority over most of the nations in the world. There are those who have information superiority equal to or maybe greater than ours who are freely using it against us. It's kind of the problem that we addressed earlier. You don't know what you don't know, but you know that you've got to keep all your apertures open to find out what's going on, to reason through what that could mean, and then to bring pressures to bear on the source of that to contain it. That's not an answer, but this is an elusive topic. Information superiority or cyber warfare is part of the answer to that. Yes, sir.
In spite of all our capabilities, we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan for... Yeah, in spite of all the knowledge we have and our mighty military, which can take on anybody in the world, we're still in Iraq, we're still in Afghanistan, and we still haven't, quote, won. Militarily, we can cause a lot of damage. Politically, we haven't been able to solve the problems and end the conflict. Weapon systems like your aircraft carriers and the aircraft on them, like any other weapon system that has ever been devised, there will be a counter to that at some point, and I think perhaps the Chinese have pretty much gotten as close as you're going to get to be able to keep them far enough away not to be able to do much damage without starting World War III. So the failure is not necessarily military, out and out full-scale war. We don't have that many opponents. But winning in a small country like Iraq and Afghanistan seems to have eluded us.
I think that we are, from what I read in the newspapers, we are coming to our withdrawal stage in Iraq. We are dancing around the subject of Afghanistan at the national level as to when we go and if we go and why we go. I mentioned earlier that my sense of it is that our being there in those two countries, to the extent that we are there with the power we have there, has been a deterrent. It hasn't been a total loss. I mean, if you're there, it's like the policeman on the corner. If you're there, you are contributing something, even though you don't know everything that's going on around you. And your readiness to go into action is a deterrent of some importance. That's not what you're driving at.
At the cost of $2 trillion, would not America be safer had we spent that same amount of money making America greater?
You know, that's another nerve you touch. I think that Khomeini got a lot of mileage out of labeling us the great Satan. And I've thought about that over the years, to wondering whether I should just be offended at that or what there is. And I can remember 50 years ago that we would brief sailors before we let them go ashore not to be the ugly American. And why? It may be that part of our way out of this morass is to cut the feet out from under the notion that we're the great Satan. I mean, there's something about what Americans have done around the world, our music, our food, the way we dress, you name it. We have alienated people whom we would just as soon not alienate, and we'd rather make friends of them. So what we project in the way of the American model is very important. We're not consistent. We're not the great Satan, in my judgment. But I know that what we do and the way we act is offensive to many. So we would be able to spend some effort, and it would be worth spending the effort on improving what we present to the world as America. You know, I'm not sure that troops bunkered down in Afghanistan are doing that. They're protecting themselves. They're handling bad guys. They are shooting up the countryside. And that's what we've been content to have them do. There might be a better way to go about that. And part of our long-term progress ought to be to figure out what it is we want to present to the world and set about doing it. I'm just anecdotally, I mentioned that two of my daughters are in Iraq now on one-year tours. One is an intelligence specialist working for the Army. The other one is an intelligence specialist working for the Department of Defense. The one that's working for the Army was approached by a member of a leading intelligence organization in Iraq for, would she be able to put together a course of instruction to teach Iraqi women how to be intelligence professionals in their world. Wow. I mean, that may be the reason she's been over there for the better part of a year, is because she is one, and she can communicate what it means to be a stand-up intelligence officer in a complex world. She may do more good in how she is able to present these views and the techniques and to help the whole citizenry of Iraq than anything else she could have thought of or been asked to do. It may be that in our approach to the world, when we leave, we ought to not only leave sweeping the streets and the doorsteps behind us to be sure that we leave the place in better condition than we found it, but we ought to see whether we can't correct mistaken imagery of what the United States of America is about, what we do, and what we can offer the world. And we may want to give as much emphasis to that as we do withdrawal.
That certainly isn't the case in Iraq. We aren't leaving the country in better condition than we found it.
We are not? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the electricity is not regular. Sadly, it's in worse shape infrastructurally because of the war.
Yes, I've read those things. I can't refute them. I've given you one example of something we're leaving behind that may be positive, that we never foresaw leaving behind if we have liberated a handful of Iraqi women to do what they want to do in the country we're leaving behind. Things like that. There must be dozens of things that are happening that are equivalent to that.
Question in the back here, Stacer.
You mentioned the Vietnam War before, and it's been speculated before whether or not that was too politically run of a war. Do you find with our defense against terrorism and how we're handling terrorism in the world, is that too politically run as well, or are our generals and our government institutions, our government officials able to combat it on their own without the involvement of politicians themselves?
I'm not back there. I'm not in a position to see it. When I was there last in Washington watching this process, the political process was more antagonistic and self-defeating than I have ever seen it in Washington. The military services were doing what they were told to do and doing it as well as they could, but I would have answered your question then by saying too much interference by people who don't know what they're talking about. But I don't know that that's still the way it is.
We have two last questions.
Okay, hear me?
Yes.
I spent 27 years in the Navy, also admiral and also pilot. But
My hat's off to you.
You too. I spent most of my time in anti-submarine warfare, and to answer some of these questions about secrecy, I see too much coming from Washington. You'll see a headline, the president or the administration announced a secret project, and they go into some detail. And this is troubling me because when I was in the Navy doing top secret things, I didn't expect it to get out to the press. We were doing things in the Sea of Japan that we hoped that, in conjunction with the Japanese military, and they didn't want the word to get out to their emperor on what we were doing in the Sea of Japan. And I think to make things a little rosier, I think there must still be a lot of smart people doing smart things that we don't know about and we shouldn't know about, and I don't know about.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We got well-meaning people who are well-trained and well-equipped, and they will, by and large, do the right thing if they have the opportunity.
Stacer, I gotta make this the last question. This is from another member of the audience that passed me a piece of paper, but I think you're gonna like this question because this is also about the Navy. The question is basically, in the 10 years since 9/11, how did that affect the Navy as an institution? How has that institution changed? So, strictly the Navy, how has 9/11 in the last 10 years changed?
Increased recruiting dramatically. We've had no dirge of young people wanting to sign up and serve. I think I read a statistic the other day that some 19,500 young people tried to get into the Naval Academy in a class of 1,200 people this year. I mean, it was an unbelievable response, and it's been sustained for the last 10 or 12 years. So that part has been good. The Navy has. They've done more. Here's my hometown example. My daughter is an individual augmentee, a naval reservist, who felt compelled to go over there and volunteer to spend a year in her area of expertise working for the Army because the Army had run out of staff to do the job. And she's one of thousands of men and women who've gone over to do that. So now the Navy has provided air cover, the Navy has done close air support, the Navy has done logistics. I think that they feel well engaged and appreciated in what they've been able to do during all this time. Heavens knows the SEALs have shown what they're capable of doing. So, the military services have to feel right and good about what they have accomplished. You and I may not know all that they've done.
Okay, on that note, I think we need to bring this to an end because it is 8:30. I hope you've all really enjoyed the remarks that Stacy made. And as you're heading out the door, I want to remind you to please provide us your thoughts. Give us your feedback on have you liked this program this evening? Has it sort of stimulated your thinking? Would you like to see more of it? Would you like to see something different? Give us some feedback. And again, if you would like to receive notifications of future events like this, give us an email address. Write it neatly on the piece of paper. And also, we have a website at the college, www.shoreline.edu/GAC. We try to put notices there of what's coming up. And if you really enjoyed this evening's conversation, think about becoming a friend of the Global Affairs Center by making a small donation, whatever you want, whatever amount you can afford to give us the funds so that we can keep doing these sort of events and providing the coffee and the refreshments at these events. And there's details in the handouts on how you can do that. Please take a look. Please feel free to take those handouts home. And thank you again for joining us this evening, and get home safely. Thank you.